Let me ask you something. What happens when the most powerful navy in the world, fresh off conquering half the Mediterranean, meets a desperate alliance of enemies who hate each other almost as much as they hate their common foe? What happens when 300 galleys clash in a narrow gulf, when 30,000 men row into point-blank cannon range, when the future of Europe depends on a single afternoon? The answer came on October 7th, 1571, in the Gulf of Patras, off the coast of Greece, at a battle called Lepanto. This wasn't just another naval engagement. This was the moment Ottoman naval dominance died, when a fractured coalition of Christian powers that could barely agree on anything assembled the largest galley fleet in history and sailed straight into the teeth of the Ottoman Armada. No romanticism, no heroic myth-making. Just the facts about how 212 Christian galleys faced off against 230 Ottoman vessels in the bloodiest naval battle of the 16th century. If this story grips you, if you walk away understanding something about Renaissance warfare and Mediterranean geopolitics you didn't know before, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. We are telling real history here, the kind that respects your intelligence. Now let's go back to 1571, to a Mediterranean sea that was becoming an Ottoman lake, and watch how everything changed in 6 hours of brutal combat. The Ottoman Empire in 1571 was at its absolute zenith. Sultan Selim II, son of Suleiman the Magnificent, ruled an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algiers to the Persian Gulf. 15 million people lived under Ottoman authority. The empire controlled the Black Sea completely, dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and was systematically conquering Venetian possessions across the Aegean and Adriatic. The Ottoman navy was the most powerful maritime force in the world. Over 200 galleys, thousands of trained oarsmen, elite Janissary marines, and commanders who'd won victory after victory against Christian fleets. They'd crushed the Knights of Malta, conquered Cyprus, raided the Italian coast with impunity. When Ottoman galleys appeared on the horizon, Christian ports panicked. This wasn't an exaggeration. This was reality. But let's zoom out and understand what was actually happening in the Mediterranean by 1571. This sea wasn't some neutral body of water. It was a war zone, divided between two civilizations that had been fighting for control since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. On one side, the Ottoman Empire, expanding aggressively, seeing the Mediterranean as rightfully theirs, a highway connecting their North African territories with Anatolia and the Balkans. On the other side, a fragmented collection of Christian powers who couldn't stand each other. Spain, the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, controlled Naples, Sicily, and much of Italy. The Venetian Republic, a fading maritime power clinging to its last possessions in Crete and Cyprus. The Papal States, with more moral authority than military power. Genoa, focused on commerce. The Knights of Malta, religious warriors who'd survived the Ottoman siege of 1565 but were severely weakened. These powers didn't trust each other. Spain and Venice had been rivals for centuries. The Pope wanted a crusade. Spain wanted to protect its interests. Venice wanted to protect its trade. Nobody wanted to pay for a fleet. This is the environment in 1570 when the Ottomans decided to conquer Cyprus. Cyprus was a Venetian possession, a critical island controlling the eastern Mediterranean. It produced grain, wine, and salt. It had strategic harbors. The Ottomans wanted it. In July 1570, an Ottoman fleet of over 300 ships descended on Cyprus, carrying 60,000 troops. The island had two major fortresses, Nicosia and Famagusta, both heavily fortified. Nicosia fell in September 1570 after a brutal siege. 20,000 Greek and Turkish soldiers died in the assault. The Ottomans massacred the garrison and much of the civilian population. Famagusta, commanded by Marcantonio Bragadin, held out for nearly a year. The defenders repelled assault after assault, countermined Ottoman siege tunnels, held the walls against overwhelming numbers. But by August 1571, the situation was hopeless. The garrison was starving, ammunition was gone, the walls were breached in multiple places. Bragadin negotiated surrender terms. The Ottomans agreed to let the garrison leave with honor. Then they broke the terms. Bragadin was arrested, tortured, and eventually flayed alive. His skin was stuffed with straw and paraded through Ottoman cities. This wasn't just cruelty. This was a message. This is what happens when you resist the Sultan. The fall of Cyprus terrified Christian Europe. If the Ottomans could take Cyprus, what was next? Crete, Sicily, Rome itself. The Ottoman fleet was unchallenged. Their army seemed invincible. Something had to be done, but creating a coalition of Christian powers to actually do something was nearly impossible. Enter Pope Pius V. Pius was a Dominican friar who'd become pope in 1566. He was austere, zealous, uncompromising, and absolutely convinced that stopping the Ottomans was God's will. He'd been trying to organize a holy league, a military alliance of Christian powers, since becoming pope. He'd failed repeatedly. Spain was more concerned about Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. Venice wanted to negotiate with the Ottomans to preserve trade. Genoa was neutral. The Italian states were paralyzed by local rivalries, but the fall of Cyprus changed the calculation. Venice, which had lost its most valuable possession, was finally willing to fight. Spain, under King Philip II, agreed to participate, partly because Philip actually took his Catholic faith seriously, partly because Ottoman power threatened Spanish interests in Italy and North Africa. The Pope convinced both powers to set aside their mutual hatred long enough to assemble a fleet. On May 25, 1571, the Holy League was formally established. Spain, Venice, and the papacy agreed to assemble a combined fleet of 200 galleys, split the costs, and appoint a supreme commander. The commander would be Don Juan of Austria, illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II, 24 years old, charismatic, ambitious, and completely inexperienced in naval warfare. This was the man who would lead the largest Christian fleet assembled in decades against the most powerful navy in the world. Let's talk about what a galley was and why this matters. A Mediterranean war galley in 1571 was not a sailing ship. It was a rowing vessel, typically about 150 feet long, narrow, with a single large sail for cruising but powered in combat by oars. Each galley had between 20 and 30 oars per side, each oar pulled by 3 to 5 men. That's anywhere from 200 to 400 rowers per ship. These rowers were slaves, convicts, prisoners of war, or sometimes free men, depending on the fleet. The conditions were horrific. Chained to their benches, rowing in synchronized rhythm, unable to escape if the ship was sinking. Galleys were designed for one thing: ramming and boarding. The bow of a galley mounted a bronze ram below the waterline and a reinforced spur above it. You rowed at maximum speed directly at an enemy ship, tried to smash through their oars or hull, then Marines boarded and fought hand-to-hand. By 1571, galleys also mounted forward-facing cannons, typically 3 to 5 heavy guns at the bow, firing directly ahead, plus smaller swivel guns along the sides. But the main weapon was still the ram and the boarding party. Naval combat in the Mediterranean was essentially land warfare conducted on floating platforms. The Holy League fleet assembled slowly through the summer of 1571. Spanish galleys from Naples and Sicily, Venetian galleys from Crete and the Adriatic, Papal galleys from Rome, Genoese galleys, Knights of Malta. By September, the fleet was concentrated at Messina, Sicily. Don Juan arrived to take command. He was young, handsome, wore gilded armor, acted like he was born to lead. Some of the older commanders resented him. The Venetian Admiral Sebastiano Venia was 65 years old, a veteran of countless battles, and didn't particularly want to take orders from a 24-year-old Spanish prince. But Don Juan had political authority and royal backing. He was in command. The assembled fleet was impressive. 212 galleys, 6 galleases, and numerous smaller vessels. Let's talk about those galleases. A galleasse was a hybrid vessel, larger and heavier than a standard galley, with higher sides, more guns, and heavier construction. The 6 Venetian galleys each mounted over 40 cannons, significantly more firepower than a standard galley. They were slower, less maneuverable, but floating fortresses compared to regular galleys. Don Juan positioned them at the front of his fleet. The plan was to let them absorb the initial Ottoman attack and use their superior firepower to disrupt the enemy formation before the galleys engaged. The Christian fleet carried approximately 30,000 soldiers and marines, plus another 50,000 rowers. These weren't just Spanish and Italian troops. There were German mercenaries, Swiss pikemen, adventurers from across Europe, even a handful of English volunteers. One of the Spanish soldiers on a galley was a 24-year-old veteran named Miguel de Cervantes. He'd later write Don Quixote. At Lepanto, he was just another soldier with a musket, waiting to see if he'd survive the day. The Ottoman fleet was already at sea. After conquering Cyprus, they'd sailed west, raiding Venetian positions, asserting dominance, looking for the Christian fleet. The Ottoman commander was Muezzin Zaid Ali Pasha, an experienced admiral, competent and cautious. His fleet numbered around 230 galleys, carrying approximately 35,000 soldiers and 50,000 rowers. The Ottomans had a numerical advantage in ships and men. They had better trained crews, more combat experience, and a decade of unbroken victories. On paper, they should win. In late September, Don Juan led the Holy League fleet out of Messina, sailing east into the Ionian Sea, looking for the Ottomans. On October 6th, scouts reported the enemy fleet anchored in the Gulf of Patras, near Lepanto on the Greek coast. The Ottomans had sailed into the Gulf to resupply and shelter from rough seas. They weren't expecting the Christian fleet to be this close, this soon, this aggressive. When scouts brought word that the Christians were approaching, Ali Pasha faced a decision. He could retreat deeper into the Gulf, use the narrow waters as a defensive position, maybe avoid battle altogether. Or he could sail out and engage. His officers debated. Some argued for caution. The Christian fleet was larger than expected. Fighting in the narrow Gulf would negate the Ottoman advantage in maneuverability. Others argued for attack. The Christians were a coalition of rivals who could barely cooperate. Hit them now before they get organized. Ali Pasha chose to fight. He formed his fleet into a line across the entrance to the Gulf and waited. On the morning of October 7, 1571, the Christian fleet rounded the headland and saw the Ottoman lines stretched across the water. This was it. The largest galley fleets in history, facing each other in a space maybe 3 miles wide. Don Juan ordered his fleet into battle formation. He divided his galleys into 3 divisions. The center, commanded by Don Juan himself, with the papal and Spanish galleys. The left wing, commanded by the Venetian Agostino Barbarigo, hugging the coast. The right wing, commanded by the Genoese Giovanni Andrea Doria, extending toward the open sea. Behind the line, a reserve force under the Spanish Marquis of Santa Cruz. The 6 galleys were positioned in front of the line, towed into position by smaller galleys. The Ottomans formed a similar line. Ali Pasha commanded the center. Maimed Sirocco commanded the Ottoman right, facing the Venetian left. Ulugh Ali, the governor of Algiers and one of the most experienced corsair commanders in the Mediterranean, commanded the Ottoman left, facing Doria. Both fleets were committed. There was no retreat, no negotiation. One fleet would be destroyed today. The wind shifted. A breeze from the west filled the sails of the Christian galleys, pushing them forward. The Ottoman galleys, facing into the wind, had to rely entirely on their oars. This was the first advantage of the day, a small one, but it mattered. Don Juan stood on the bow of his flagship, the real, wearing gilded armor, holding a crucifix. He'd ordered every ship to fly a banner with the image of Christ. This wasn't just a battle, it was a crusade. Across the water, Ali Pasha watched the Christian fleet advance. His flagship, the Sultana, flew the green banner of Islam. Behind him, 230 galleys filled with soldiers who'd conquered half the Mediterranean, who believed they were invincible. The galleys opened fire first. At roughly 400 yards, the 6 Venetian hybrid ships unleashed their cannons. Heavy iron balls slammed into the Ottoman line, smashing through oars, punching holes in hulls, killing rowers. The Ottomans had never faced this kind of concentrated firepower from ships before. Their own galleys mounted fewer, lighter guns. They tried to row around the galleases, but the big ships turned their broadsides and fired again, grape shot shredding the Ottoman front ranks. This bought time for the main Christian line to close the distance. The Ottoman galleys rode through the galleys' fire, taking casualties but maintaining formation. By 11 a.m., the two lines collided. The center squadrons hit first. Don Juan's reel rammed directly into Ali Pasha's Sultana. Both flagships crashed together with a splintering of oars and hulls. Marines from both sides poured onto the decks, fighting with swords, pikes, muskets, and arquebuses. The two admirals could see each other across the deck, separated by a mass of fighting men. The battle for the flagships became the symbolic center of the entire engagement. If Don Juan died, the Christian fleet might break. If Ali Pasha died, the Ottoman center could collapse. Both sides knew this. Reinforcements from nearby galleys swarmed toward the locked flagships, boarding from both sides, turning the two vessels into a single platform of chaotic melee. Hundreds of men fought in a space the size of a tennis court. Bodies fell into the water. Blood covered the decks. Musket fire at point-blank range, pike thrusts, sword cuts. Men slipped on gore and were trampled by others fighting overhead. This went on for an hour. Meanwhile, the left wing descended into its own apocalyptic struggle. Barbarigo's Venetian galleys, hugging the coast, tried to prevent maimed Sirocco's Ottoman right wing from outflanking them. The fighting here was brutal. Galleys rammed, grappled, fought, sank. Barbarigo himself was hit in the eye by an arrow early in the battle and mortally wounded. His second-in-command took over, but the Venetian left was under tremendous pressure. The Ottomans tried repeatedly to get around the Venetian flank, reach the shore, and turn the Christian line. The Venetians stopped them every time, but at horrific cost. Ships on both sides were sinking. Rowers drowned chained to their benches. Soldiers in armor who fell into the water sank like stones. On the right wing, something different was happening. Giovanni Andrea Doria, commanding the Genoese and Spanish galleys, was moving away from the center, extending his line south toward open water. This created a gap between his squadron and Don Juan's center. Uluç Ali, the Ottoman left-wing commander, saw the opportunity immediately. This man was not some court-appointed admiral. He was Uluç Ali Reis, known to Christians as Occhiali, a Calabrian fisherman who'd been captured by corsairs, converted to Islam, and risen through sheer competence to become one of the most feared naval commanders in the Mediterranean. He was a tactical genius, and he saw that Doria had overextended. Uluç Ali drove his squadron through the gap, cutting behind Doria's line and falling on the Christian left rear. His galleys surrounded and overwhelmed several Christian vessels, including the flagship of the Knights of Malta. The Knights fought with their usual desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Maltese flagship was captured, the Knights slaughtered or taken prisoner. The Holy League's right wing was collapsing. This was the crisis of the battle. Don Juan was locked in combat with Ali Pasha's flagship. The Venetian left was holding, but taking terrible casualties. And now Uluç Ali had broken through the right and was threatening to roll up the Christian line from the rear. If he succeeded, the entire Christian fleet could be surrounded and destroyed. The Marquis of Santa Cruz, commanding the reserve squadron, saw the danger. He led his 30 fresh galleys directly toward Uluç Ali's advancing squadron. The reserve hit Uluç Ali from the side just as he was pressing his advantage. Santa Cruz's galleys rammed into the Ottoman left. Boarding actions erupted across a dozen ships simultaneously. Uluç Ali was forced to turn and face this new threat, abandoning his attack on the Christian rear. This bought time for Doria to regroup his scattered right wing and return to the fight. Now let's go back to the center. Don Juan's reel and Ali Pasha's Sultana had been locked together for over an hour. The decks were piled with bodies. Both flagships had taken point-blank cannon fire from supporting galleys, splintering rails and masts. Ali Pasha was wounded, still directing his men, but visibly weakening. Then a Spanish arquebusier shot him in the head. Ali Pasha fell. His officers tried to hide his death, but word spread through the Ottoman center within minutes. The commander was dead. Some Ottoman galleys began to pull back. Don Juan's men severed Ali Pasha's head and mounted it on a pike at the bow of the reel. This was psychological warfare. Every Ottoman sailor who saw that head knew their admiral was dead. The Ottoman center began to disintegrate. Galleys tried to disengage, to row back toward the Gulf, but Christian ships swarmed them. The earlier galleys' fire had damaged so many Ottoman vessels that their mobility was compromised. Ships with shattered oars couldn't maneuver, couldn't escape. Christian galleys ran them down and boarded them one by one. On the left wing, the death of Ali Pasha and the collapse of the Ottoman center broke the morale of maimed Sirocco's squadron. Sirocco had been pressing the Venetians hard, trying to break their line, but now he was surrounded. His galley was boarded, Sirocco was killed, and the Ottoman right wing started surrendering or fleeing. Venetian galleys, exhausted and bloodied, began capturing Ottoman vessels wholesale. Ships that had been fighting tooth and nail suddenly struck their colors or tried to run. Most didn't make it. The Venetians had lost too many friends, seen too much blood to show much mercy. Prisoners were taken, but not many. Ulugh Ali, seeing the center and right collapse, made the only rational decision. He broke off the fight and ran. His squadron disengaged from Santa Cruz's reserves, and Doria's regrouped right wing, rowing south at maximum speed toward the open sea. Some Christian galleys pursued, but Ulugh Ali was too skilled, too fast. He escaped with about 30 galleys, the only significant Ottoman force to survive the battle intact. By 4 p.m., 6 hours after the first cannon fired, the battle was over. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed. Of the 230 Ottoman galleys, approximately 50 were sunk, 130 were captured, and only about 40 escaped. The rest were wrecked, burning, or scattered. The human cost was staggering. The Ottomans lost between 20,000 and 30,000 men killed, wounded, or drowned. Another 8,000 were captured as prisoners. The Christian fleet lost around 8,000 men killed and twice that wounded. 12 Christian galleys were sunk or so badly damaged they had to be scuttled. But they'd won. The largest galley battle in history had ended in the total destruction of Ottoman naval power. The galleys captured at Lepanto were towed back to Christian ports and incorporated into the victorious fleets. Christian prisoners, thousands of them, were freed from the rowing benches of captured Ottoman galleys, many of them men who'd been enslaved for years. Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote, was wounded 3 times during the battle, including a shot that permanently crippled his left hand. He would later call Lepanto the greatest occasion that past or present ages have seen or future ones may hope to see. Let's talk about why this battle mattered. The immediate strategic impact was limited. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year. Ulugh Ali was appointed Grand Admiral and oversaw the construction of over 200 new galleys. By 1572, the Ottoman navy was back to numerical strength. The Holy League fractured almost immediately after the victory. Venice, exhausted and bankrupt, negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573, agreeing to pay an indemnity and abandon Cyprus permanently. Spain turned its attention back to the Netherlands and the growing conflict with England. The Pope died in 1572, and his successors lacked his zeal for crusade. The coalition that won Lepanto dissolved. So if the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet and the Holy League fell apart, why does Lepanto matter? Because the myth of Ottoman invincibility died at Lepanto. For decades, Christian powers had believed the Ottoman navy couldn't be beaten in a major engagement. Every significant naval battle in the 16th century had ended in Ottoman victory. The Siege of Malta in 1565 had been held barely, but the Ottoman fleet had controlled the sea. At Lepanto, a Christian fleet met the Ottomans in open battle and annihilated them. The psychological impact was enormous. Christian Europe, which had been on the defensive for a century, suddenly believed it could win. Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean stopped. The Ottomans never again seriously threatened Italian waters. They rebuilt their fleet, yes, but they used it defensively, protecting their existing possessions rather than conquering new ones. The westward expansion of the Ottoman Empire had reached its high-water mark. After Lepanto, it was over. The other reason Lepanto matters is what it revealed about galley warfare. The galleys, the hybrid ships with heavy cannon, proved devastatingly effective. Within a few decades, Mediterranean naval powers began shifting away from oar-powered galleys towards sail-powered galleons with broadside cannons. Lepanto was one of the last great galley battles. The future belonged to sailing warships that could mount dozens of cannons and didn't rely on thousands of rowers. The age of the galley was ending. Lepanto marked the transition. Now let's talk about the human stories. Don Juan of Austria became a hero across Europe. He was celebrated, feted, showered with honors. Pope Pius V called him the savior of Christendom. Philip II of Spain was less enthusiastic. He'd never entirely trusted his illegitimate half-brother, and Don Juan's sudden fame made him nervous. Philip assigned Don Juan to fight rebels in the Netherlands, a miserable, unwinnable campaign far from the glory of Lepanto. Don Juan died in 1578 of typhus, aged 31, having never matched his triumph at Lepanto. Sebastiano Venia, the Venetian admiral who'd been mortally wounded early in the battle, survived his wound and lived another 6 years. He became Doge of Venice in 1577, the highest honor the Republic could bestow. He died in 1578, remembered as one of Venice's greatest commanders. Uluç Ali, the only Ottoman commander to escape Lepanto with his squadron intact, was promoted to Grand Admiral and led the Ottoman naval reconstruction. He served with distinction until his death in 1587, never losing his reputation as one of the finest naval tacticians of the age. He understood that Lepanto had been lost not because of cowardice or incompetence, but because the Christian galleys had neutralized the Ottoman advantage in numbers and maneuverability. He incorporated heavier guns into the rebuilt Ottoman fleet. Marcantonio Bragadin, the Venetian commander of Famagusta who'd been flayed alive by the Ottomans, became a martyr. His skin, paraded through Ottoman cities as a trophy, was eventually recovered by Venetian agents years later and brought back to Venice, where it's still preserved in a church. His death became a rallying cry for Christian resistance to the Ottomans. Miguel de Cervantes spent the rest of his life partly defined by Lepanto. He was proud of his service, proud of his wounds, proud that he'd been part of the greatest Christian victory of the century. When he wrote Don Quixote decades later, he included references to Lepanto, calling it the most glorious event in history. The thousands of anonymous soldiers, rowers, sailors, who fought and died at Lepanto left no individual records, but their collective sacrifice decided the battle. The Christian rowers who powered the galleys through 6 hours of combat, the Janissaries who boarded enemy ships knowing most wouldn't survive, the Spanish tercio soldiers who held the decks against overwhelming numbers, the Venetian marines who fought to the last man on sinking galleys. They're the ones who actually won Lepanto, not the admirals, not the strategies, but the men doing the fighting and dying. The aftermath of Lepanto was messy and anticlimactic. The captured Ottoman galleys were divided among the victors, leading to immediate disputes. Spain wanted the lion's share. Venice claimed it had suffered the most casualties. The Pope insisted some vessels go to the papal fleet. Don Juan tried to mediate, but the coalition was fracturing before the smoke had cleared. The plan had been to follow up Lepanto with an immediate attack on Ottoman territories, maybe recapture Cyprus, maybe strike at Constantinople itself. It didn't happen. The fleet returned to Italy, the various squadrons dispersed to their home ports, and the opportunity was lost. By the time anyone seriously discussed another campaign, winter storms had made operations impossible. The next year, 1572, the Holy League assembled another fleet, but it achieved nothing. The Ottomans avoided battle, the Christians raided a few coastal towns, and everyone went home. The coalition was already dying. Venice, the power that had lost the most and stood to gain the most from continued war, was also the most exhausted. The Venetian economy was in shambles. The cost of maintaining galley fleets was astronomical. Thousands of skilled sailors and soldiers were dead. The Venetian Senate debated for months, then chose peace. In 1573, Venice signed a treaty with the Ottomans, formally ceding Cyprus, paying a war indemnity of 300,000 ducats and resuming trade relations. The other Christian powers felt betrayed, but they didn't keep fighting either. Spain had its own wars to worry about. The Dutch revolt was consuming enormous resources. England was becoming a problem. The Mediterranean, for all its symbolic importance, was a secondary theatre for Philip II. The Pope had no military power without Spanish and Venetian cooperation. By 1574, the Holy League existed only on paper. The great coalition that had won Lepanto was gone. Does that make Lepanto meaningless? No, because the strategic reality had changed. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet, but they never again attempted large-scale offensive operations in the Western Mediterranean. They held what they had, defended their positions, but the era of expansion was over. The psychological blow of Lepanto couldn't be undone. Ottoman sultans and generals knew that Christian fleets could mass, could fight, could win. That knowledge changed behavior. The Ottomans turned their attention east, toward Persia, toward the Caucasus, away from the Mediterranean. The Western Mediterranean became relatively stable. Not peaceful, there were still raids and skirmishes, but the existential threat to Christian Europe was gone. Let me circle back to the battle itself, to what actually decided the outcome. It wasn't divine intervention. It wasn't superior courage or moral righteousness. It was a combination of factors, some planned, some accidental, that gave the Christians just enough advantage to prevail in a battle that could have gone either way. First, the galleys. Those 6 hybrid ships were the decisive weapon. Their heavy cannons disrupted the Ottoman formation before the main lines collided, killing hundreds of rowers, damaging dozens of galleys, creating chaos. Without the galleys, the Ottoman numerical advantage would have been overwhelming. Second, the wind. The westerly breeze that filled Christian sails and forced the Ottomans to row into the wind was pure luck, but it mattered. Tired rowers are less effective. Momentum matters in galley warfare. Third, leadership. Don Juan held the center when it was under extreme pressure. Santa Cruz used the reserve at exactly the right moment to stop Ulloch Ali's breakthrough. Barbarigo's Venetians held the left despite being outflanked and losing their commander. These were good tactical decisions executed under extreme stress. Fourth, firepower. The Christian fleet had more and heavier guns than the Ottomans expected. The Spanish tercios carried more arquebuses and muskets per man than typical Ottoman janissaries. In the boarding actions, that extra firepower created local superiorities that won individual fights. Fifth, the death of Ali Pasha. If the Ottoman commander had survived another hour, if he'd been able to rally his center when it started to waver, the outcome might have been different. His death broke Ottoman morale at the critical moment. Sixth, Ulloch Ali's isolation. If the Ottoman left wing had coordinated with the center, if Ulloch Ali had received support when he broke through the Christian right, he might have turned the battle. Instead, he was left to fight Santa Cruz and Doria alone, and when the center collapsed, he had no choice but to run. These factors combined in a way that favored the Christians. Change any one of them, and Lepanto might have been an Ottoman victory. That's how close it was. This wasn't a foregone conclusion. This was 2 evenly matched fleets destroying each other, with the Christians maintaining cohesion just long enough to break Ottoman resistance. By late afternoon on October 7, 1571, the Gulf of Patras was a scene of absolute carnage. Hundreds of shattered galleys floated in the calm water, some burning, some sinking, some drifting with their oars shattered and their crews dead or fled. Bodies floated everywhere, thousands of them, Christians and Muslims tangled together in death. The water was red, that's not metaphor. With 30,000 casualties in a relatively confined space, the water was literally stained red with blood. Survivors clung to wreckage, calling for help in a dozen languages. Rescue efforts were haphazard. Christian galleys picked up their own men first, then prisoners, then gave up because there were too many and night was falling. The Christian fleet anchored for the night in the Gulf, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle. Exhausted men tried to sleep on blood-stained decks. Surgeons worked through the night, amputating shattered limbs, digging out bullets and arrow points, sewing wounds. The sounds of wounded men screaming carried across the water. There was no celebration that night. Everyone was too exhausted, too traumatized, too aware of how many friends were dead. The next morning, Don Juan organized the fleet for the journey back to Italy. Captured Ottoman galleys had to be repaired enough to be towed or sailed. The most damaged Christian galleys were stripped of anything useful and scuttled. The thousands of freed Christian slaves, men who'd been chained to Ottoman rowing benches for months or years, had to be fed and distributed among the returning ships. The wounded had to be cared for, the dead had to be buried or committed to the sea. It took 3 days to organize the return voyage. When the fleet finally left the Gulf of Patras, it left behind a graveyard. For years afterward, wreckage washed up on the shores of western Greece. Splintered oars, pieces of hull, rusted weapons, bones. The battle had ended, but its physical traces remained. The return to Italy was a triumph. Every port the fleet passed celebrated. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered to see the captured Ottoman galleys and banners. Don Juan was hailed as a hero. Pope Pius V declared a day of thanksgiving. Masses were said across Catholic Europe celebrating the victory. The news of Lepanto spread across the continent in weeks, carried by dispatch riders, merchants, and letters. Protestant Europe was more ambivalent. England and the Dutch rebels were fighting Spain. They weren't inclined to celebrate a Spanish victory, even one against the Ottomans. But even Protestant commentators acknowledged that Lepanto was significant. The Ottoman Empire, the greatest threat to Christendom for a century, had been defeated in open battle. That mattered to everyone. In the Ottoman Empire, the news of Lepanto was devastating. Sultan Selim II was reportedly furious. Ali Pasha's family fell from favor. The survivors who'd fled the battle faced accusations of cowardice. Uluç Ali, the only commander who'd fought well and escaped, was one of the few who emerged with reputation intact. The Ottoman government launched an immediate shipbuilding program. New galleys were laid down in shipyards across the empire. Timber was requisitioned from the Black Sea and Anatolia. Thousands of workers were pressed into service. The Ottomans were determined to rebuild their fleet as quickly as possible to show that Lepanto was a setback, not a defeat. Within a year, they'd succeeded. By 1572, the Ottoman navy had over 200 galleys again, more than they'd had before Lepanto. Ottoman officials bragged that while the Christians had singed the Sultan's beard at Lepanto, it had grown back thicker than before. This was propaganda, but it was effective. The Christian powers, seeing the Ottoman fleet rebuilt so quickly, lost much of their enthusiasm for continued war. If one catastrophic defeat didn't stop the Ottomans, what would? The answer, it turned out, was nothing. The Ottoman Empire couldn't be defeated by a single battle, but it could be checked. After Lepanto, Ottoman ambitions in the Mediterranean were limited. They'd lost their aura of invincibility. They'd lost thousands of experienced sailors and soldiers who couldn't be replaced in a year. They de-learned that Christian fleets could coordinate, could fight, could win. That lesson shaped Ottoman strategy for decades. So here's the final analysis. Lepanto was the largest galley battle ever fought. 240-something galleys, 80,000 men, 6 hours of combat, 38,000 casualties. It was a decisive Christian victory that broke Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. It was also strategically inconclusive, followed by a rebuilt Ottoman fleet and a collapsed Christian coalition. It was psychologically crucial, proving that the Ottomans could be beaten but materially limited, changing nothing about territorial control. It was a transitional battle, one of the last great galley engagements, demonstrating that the future of naval warfare belonged to sailing ships with heavy guns, not oar-powered rams. It was everything and nothing, a great victory that didn't lead to strategic gains. A crushing defeat that didn't end Ottoman power, a turning point that turned nothing except perception, and maybe that's enough. Maybe battles matter not just for their immediate results, but for what they reveal about capabilities and limits. Lepanto revealed that Christian Europe could unite when threatened. It revealed that Ottoman expansion had reached its limits. It revealed that galley warfare was becoming obsolete. These revelations shaped the next century of Mediterranean history. The Ottoman Empire remained powerful, but it never again threatened to dominate the Mediterranean the way it had before Lepanto. Christian Europe remained divided, but it never again faced the existential naval threat that had terrorized coastal cities for generations. The battle created a new equilibrium, not peace, but a balance of power that neither side could easily overturn. The men who fought at Lepanto didn't know they were fighting a transitional battle. They thought they were fighting for survival, for religion, for glory, for their homelands. They fought with extraordinary courage on both sides, Janissaries boarding Christian galleys under musket fire. Spanish soldiers holding deck positions against overwhelming numbers. Venetian marines dying to protect their city's last possessions. Ottoman oarsmen rowing into cannon fire because their commanders ordered it. All of them deserve to be remembered, not as heroes or villains, but as men caught in a moment of history, doing what they thought was necessary, paying the price for decisions made by distant rulers. If this story taught you something, if you understand Lepanto better now, if you see the complexity behind the myth, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you want more stories like this, stories that respect the courage of people on all sides while acknowledging the political realities that drove them to war. Share this video if you think others should understand what actually happened at Lepanto, not the propaganda version, not the simplified myth, but the messy, bloody, complicated truth. Subscribe if you want more history that doesn't insult your intelligence, that doesn't reduce complex events to good guys and bad guys, that tells you what happened and why it matters without the sugar coating. Lepanto happened. 240 galleys clashed in a gulf off western Greece. 30,000 men died in 6 hours. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed and rebuilt. The Christian coalition won and fell apart. The Mediterranean balance of power shifted without territory changing hands. That's history, not simple, not satisfying, not neat, but real. And that's what we're here for, the real history. The hard history, the history that makes you think. Thank you for watching. Remember what happened at Lepanto. Remember the courage and the cost. Remember that great victories can be strategically inconclusive, that wars are decided by more than battles, and that the stories we tell about the past shape how we understand the present. See you in the next one.